Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As we lay our heads to the pillow at night, we find that most of us dream. Well, there are a fair amount of us that don't believe we do, but the problem is that many of us probably just don't remember what those dreams are. Then there are some of us who not only dream regularly, but take it to a level of what is known as lucidity. And the moment that you actually find yourself in the dream state, having a dream, you become awake in the dream, and you find that you're able to guide and actually change its outcome. There are many books that are written out there about dreams. There's dream interpretation, the philosophy, and of course the science of dreaming. It's a whole slew and a gamut of an industry of people trying to understand just what dreams truly are. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who began studying dreams while working with children at a mental health clinic in the late 1960s. And it was at that time that he also attended seminars offered by Gestalt therapists who were also dream experts as well. It led him to develop his own simple, effective method of dream interpretation. While doing his research, he was struck by how dreamlike the unusual events of waking life can be. The understanding that one can analyze and interpret these waking life events, reaching the same kinds of profound, helpful insights that one gains from nighttime dreams, revolutionized the approach to dreams and their purpose in our lives. I think when you're listening to this program today, you're going to probably hear some things that, well, they're certainly going to be extremely enlightening to say the least. And as someone who has interviewed many dream experts from around the world, I certainly can say that the ideas that are shared in here are some of the most revolutionary and certainly the most profoundly insightful I've ever heard of. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, author of the book Always Dreaming. It's a 5-step technique for interpreting our waking dreams like conflicts. David Rivedis is joining us here on the program. David, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, it's certainly a pleasure to have you on the show. And as I was saying as I was introducing you there, I've done a lot of work in this area, a lot of reading, and there are a lot of books out there. And the first thing I will say is that those books out there about dream interpretation, for the most part, that seem to have a very universal appeal as how the symbols of what you have in your dreams. Well, I kind of dismiss those because you're so right on in the book when you say dreaming is very individual. Tell us, I kind of went over how you got started, but you really got started into it. It was back in the 1980s, a little more than 30 years ago.
Yeah, that was the time when my kids were of an age where I could begin to concentrate on what at the time was really a hobby for me. It became more serious the more I did it, but it was also during that time that the whole concept that maybe dreams don't stop when we wake up in the morning came into my awareness. And I began experimenting with that whole idea where you take unusual events from your daytime and you analyze them exactly as if they were a dream that you had while you were asleep. And I was quite flabbergasted to discover that, in fact, it works exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm. Now, as I was saying, there's so many books out there about dream interpretation. And I've had some really interesting experts on the program about how they came to approach this subject more of really let's look at symbolism and what these things mean. But yours, as I was saying, comes to a point where it's not as universal as everybody out there would like to believe, but it's very individual. How did you come to some of these conclusions here?
Well, okay, let's back up a little bit and talk about the first, not the first one, but certainly one of the big psychiatrists who decided that certain dream symbols were universal, and that's Carl Jung. And he's an individual that I have read every single one of his books at least once, and I have enormous respect for him. And he talked about the archetypical dream symbol, that certain symbols that come into your dreams are the same because they are part of what he referred to as the collective consciousness, in that everybody is part of the same culture, and so they tend to view certain things in our culture the same way. there is a great deal of truth to that. But what I began to discover as I was working with dreams is that even the dream symbols that are the most archetypical, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute here, even the ones that are the most archetypical always have an overlay of personal experience on the part of the dreamer. And that got me thinking about maybe it's not such a good idea to have preconceived ideas about what a dream symbol means. And what I began to discover is the more I left the interpretation up to the dreamer, him or herself, the more accurate the interpretation of the symbol became. Now let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's take mother. So mother is an archetypical symbol. The mother is that human who gives us all life. Now that's something that even transcends culture. That is the nature of any life form, really, in the animal kingdom for sure, and certainly among humans. So you can say, well, a mother is an archetype symbol. A mother is that individual who brings us into life. Okay, and so fine. So far we're all in agreement that that's an archetypical symbol. But now if you just sit back and you line up 10 people in a row and you say to each of them, tell me about your mom, I think it's not difficult for anybody to understand that you're going to get 10 very different attitudes about 10 people's mothers. And so you have to overlay this individual experience that an individual dreamer has onto this archetypical symbol, which is this individual who gave us life. Let's say the individual dreamer has a really good relationship with their mother, and so maybe the concept of having maybe if this individual dreams about their mother in the dream, there's going to be a feeling of real harmony. There's going to be a feeling of, oh my gosh, well I'm in life and I've been given birth, and that's a really great thing. On the other hand, if an individual has an abrased relationship with their mother, if they have a dream with their mother in it, this archetypical symbol of coming into life or being given birth into life is going to be overlaid with a very different attitude. It's one that may be full of frustration, or it may be full of fear or anger, or a sense of abandonment. So on the one hand, you do have this archetypical symbol that is universal. That absolutely is the case. That transcends everything. All of us have mothers. On the other hand, then you have to overlay it with this idea that everybody's experience with their mother is unique, and that is going to be part of the symbol, of the interpretation of the symbol in a dream if one dreams about one's mother.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about, for instance, the perception, or at least the ideas in the West that we have about dreaming versus the East. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, okay, West and East also is a broad generalization, and I'm guilty of that in the book because I do talk about West and East quite a bit in there. But, for example, this whole idea that dreaming doesn't stop when we wake up in the morning is something that is much more in tune with the culture, or maybe plural, the cultures of the East, the Asian cultures, than it is in the West. If I go to an average American or a European and say, you know, even while you're driving your car, or even while you are eating your breakfast, you are in the middle of a dream, they will look at me rather cockeyed, as if, you know, there is something not quite right in my brain. Whereas if you express that concept to someone whose philosophic approach is more Eastern, let's say East Indian, Hindu, or Buddhist, they are not going to have such a hard time with that. And in fact, you'd find quite a bit of agreement about that. really what I'm doing in the book as I try to introduce these concepts, this is nothing new. These ideas have been around for thousands of years. And in fact, they have even been around for thousands of years in Western culture. We just refer to them by a different name. We talk about omens, and we talk about prescient experiences, let's say, where something weird happens. Native Americans, maybe that's the best culture to talk about because it's really a bridge between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. They absolutely acknowledge the concept of the totem. And the totem, as I think just about every listener knows, is when an animal appears that has significance. An animal comes and appears in your life at an unexpected moment. And Native Americans put great importance and significance on an experience like that. But that's exactly what I'm talking about, that there are our waking experiences are not as objective as we tend to think that they ought to be or tend to believe that they are. And in fact, they alter themselves to fit our needs at any given and particular time. Mm-hmm. So that if you are going along and you're driving in your car, let's say, and you pull up to a stoplight, and all of a sudden a squirrel hops on the hood of your car, that's probably an experience that only is going to happen to you once in your life, especially if you live in an urban area. That's something to look at. A Native American would see right away that is an experience that came to you because you needed to hear a message at a certain time. Mm-hmm. Now, not all of these experiences involve animals. There are lots and lots of experiences that we have that are a little bit strange, that are out of the ordinary or sometimes downright shocking or repetitive. And those are the ones that we need to pay attention to because that's more than an objective experience. That is a message that's being delivered that can be interpreted metaphorically, just as if it were a dream, with exactly the same results.
It's also such a fascinating world when people, when you talk about dreams, it's almost unanimous most of the time. People love to talk about dreams. They love to share their ideas. But more importantly, what you tend to get more of is curiosity. I had this dream the other night, and I'm wondering if you can tell me what it is. Now, I guess what I mean by that is I remember when I first began becoming or having my first lucid dream was between the age of 6 and 7. And it had to do with this fear that I had in my dream that Godzilla, of all things, was chasing me, in a field. Now, I couldn't see Godzilla, but I could hear the thundering footsteps. And so being disturbed by this, I asked my mother, I'm really kind of worried about this dream, I'm having where Godzilla chases me, and just as a matter of factly, she says, well, why don't you just turn around and face him? Okay, well, as a kid, you really don't know any difference, so you figure, well, Mom must be right. So sure enough, that's exactly what I did. So in the next dream that I had with Godzilla, it was like the voice came and said, turn around and face him. So I turned around and faced, but Godzilla wasn't there, and it turned out to be this tall, blonde woman who eventually turned around, walked around the corner of a house, and disappeared, and that was it. And I didn't really have that dream afterwards, but I guess what happened from that is, as a kid, I became curious and started realizing, well, if I could do that, what else could I do? And then through my entire life, I sort of worked at different things, and you talk about this in the book of Lucidity, but I didn't want to jump too far ahead on this yet. But the idea that, well, if you have the ability to, let's say, control the outcome of your dreams or co-participate in a very active way, why won't we be able to do this out in life? And you talk about the waking dreams, well, that the idea that the outer world of your life, for instance, is a direct reflection in many ways of what's going on in your inner life. Now, that being said, especially in the West today, we seem to be playfully curious about physics and scientific physics. and that we see movies such as What the Bleep Do We Know or The Secret out there that are telling us we're empowered, we've got this genie in our bottle, we can go out there and we can create a life any way we choose to do. We certainly have enough gurus out there who are promising this, but certainly also a lot of frustrated students and followers wondering, wait a minute, I think I'm doing this, then why is all of this happening? And I like, and this is also, of course, later in your book, too, that you talk about the fact, well, if I'm going on in my life and everything seems to be working well, why do these strange and sometimes devastating random acts in life come along? You know, is it fate, kismet, whatever you want to call it, or is it that it is an organized design and that maybe we weren't paying attention to the messages as much as we should?
Well, Daniel, first of all, congratulations on your early lucid dream. And before I deal with the whole idea of why strange things come into our lives, let me just say very briefly that your early lucid dream is an absolutely classic case of how people understand that they are dreaming lucidly. And especially kids are very good at this, where you a common scene that one experiences in a lucid dream is, let's say, Godzilla. In your case, you didn't see Godzilla, but in some kids' dreams, they see Godzilla, only he's wearing, pink ballet slippers.
How about that?
and the thing that triggers the understanding that it's a dream is that there's just a tiny bit of pulling back on the dreamer's part to view this, and they say, wait a minute, Godzilla doesn't wear pink ballet slippers. Mm-hmm. There's something wrong. And it's there's something wrong that triggers the understanding that, wait a minute, this isn't waking life. This must be a dream. And that is a very, very common awakening into lucidity, and I congratulate you on that experience. That's really wonderful. But that then segues exactly into the fact that actually when we are wide awake and going about the normal business of our day, I know that every single one of us here who is listening can identify with the fact that there have been experiences we have had where our first reaction is, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture. This cannot be happening. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly the same as if a dream that you have at night. The thing, going back to what we were saying earlier about the difference between Eastern philosophic approach and Western philosophic approach, is that in the West, we tend to make a very delineated difference between what happens in our awakened state and what happens in what we refer to as our dream state, which is when we're asleep at night. And I argue, based on now over 3 decades of experience dealing with these kinds of incidents, that there is far less difference between our awakened state and our dream state than most of us are willing to admit. Mm-hmm. And that is, again, a far more Eastern philosophic approach. And so now to get back to your point that you were making, why do these strange occurrences happen in our lives, especially the ones where we say, I can't believe this just happened to me, or this has never happened to me before, and it's upsetting. That seems to be, by the way, the bottom line of all of these experiences. If they're important, they're going to stick with you. They're not going to go away because there was something disconcerting about them. And they stay with you for hours, sometimes days and weeks, and for lots of dreamers, actually much, much longer, years and decades. But the reason that I have discovered that these crazy, sometimes upsetting incidents come into our lives is because there is something we need to look at. In other words, you talked about the gurus who say, if you follow a certain path or you do something a certain way, you are going to have a true path to your own enlightenment, and everything's going to be rosy, and you're never going to have any financial problems anymore, and your love life's going to be perfect. Well, actually what the dreams are telling you is they are in support of that, but they are telling you when you need to make a little course correction, or sometimes a really big course correction. If you allow a situation or a philosophic approach to life to go on longer than it ought to, for you to be on a straighter path toward where you're trying to go. So let's say, well, gee, I would really like to be free of all of the unnecessary hassles that come into my life and just live a pure existence, let's say, working for spirit. Well, okay, so you're marching along on your merry way, and as you grow, inevitably you are going to make a slight turn to the left or a slight turn to the right off of the straight and narrow path. That's totally human. That's going to happen. Well, the dream comes along and it says, excuse me, you need to make a little course correction here. We need a little navigation here to put you back straight. And so I am going to deliver a message to you that's about your own behavior or your own philosophy or your own attitude that is getting in your own way. And I will do it through the universal language of metaphor. That's the language that dreams speak. And so I will give you a scenario, usually starting off in the sleep state, where you have a bizarre bunch of symbols that don't make any sense, like Godzilla walking in pink ballet slippers or whatever it might be. And it startles you enough that it's time, if you're 6, to talk to your mom about it, and her advice was perfect, or that you need to look at it from the perspective of a metaphor and work through the metaphor and see what the message is that is being delivered to you. Okay, now, if you're like most of us, what you're going to do is you're going to say, boy, that was an interesting dream, or maybe you're not even going to remember the dream at all. And suddenly some inner alarm bells start going off that you're not aware of. And they say, you know, you really need to pay attention to this. This is a bigger issue than you are aware of. And so since you didn't pay attention to that message, I'm going to deliver another message or another set of images with the same message, but I'm going to deliver it a little bit more emphatically. And
I kind of like this because it reminds me of a couple of cliches that I think are very relevant. What is it? When God wants your attention, he'll tickle you with a feather. If he doesn't get it, he's going to hit you with a rock. Something like that.
That's right. And in fact, I have a wonderful story that I can tell you right now. It's a little bit off the course here, but it's just so delightful. I never forgot it. The student, the new seeker, comes up to his guru, and he says, "Master, I have this donkey, and this donkey will not do anything I want it to. I have tried coaxing it, and I have tried petting it, and I have tried shoving it from behind, and I have tried screaming at it, and it will not do anything." And the guru says, that's because, my son, you have to deal with this donkey with love. Come, I will show you. So the master follows the student, the seeker, to where his donkey is, and the master looks around, and there's this huge timber lying on the ground, and it's almost more than the guru can lift, but he manages somehow to lift it over his head, and he smashes it down on the donkey's head. And the seeker is absolutely appalled. He said, Master, you said that you needed to treat my donkey with love. And the master said, and so I will, my son. But first, I had to get his attention. That's one of my favorite parables, and you're absolutely right. That is what happens. We are given the messages gently first, and then when we don't pay any attention, often if it involves a dream, the dream goes from the sleep state to the waking state. Mm-hmm. So let's give an example. Let's say you have a dream of falling down and hurting yourself, and it's a sleeping dream. Well, you know that's disconcerting, but you wake up in the morning and you check yourself out, and there are no bumps and bruises and scratches. Well, you don't pay any attention to that. So the next thing that happens is you have a comparable experience in the awakened state. And suddenly you have to pay a little more attention to it because it might involve a trip to the doctor or the emergency room or at least some discomfort for sure.
Well, at least in dreams, you can jump off of very high buildings and you stand the chance of flying, but I certainly wouldn't recommend that in the waking life.
I would agree with that.
Now, here's what I love about what you wrote, too, and I've read this in some books over the years and even had the opportunity to interview with an Australian author who actually comes to the Northwest from time to time, and he conducts dream circles. I think his name was Robert Moss. And he talked a lot in his book back in the day about we're being dream journalists. So in many ways, he follows along the same trajectory that you do, just kind of veers a little bit different. But what was fascinating about talking with this gentleman and even going out and having lunch with him is we got into, it was a good couple of hours of talking about this, and I said, like you say in your book, that the waking life and the dreaming life, there's a very thin veil that separates them, but as you were saying earlier, there's really not a difference between the two outside of the fact that it's our beliefs about the two. In our waking life, we believe it's logical and objective, whereas in our dreaming world, it's illogical, it's fractured, it kind of plays by its own rules, and it seems more subjective at times. And I found that as we were talking that I started sharing a couple of experiences that I thought were really interesting that I think some of our listeners can really relate to and see and begin to understand the possibilities of, as you said, paying attention to the dreams, whether they're waking or whether you're asleep. There was one time I was having a dream, and it was about meeting this guy, and he had this very unusual mark that was actually right around his neck. And I didn't know this guy, never met him, never seen him. The very next day, with a girl that I was dating at the time, she decided, I'd like to go and see this friend of mine if that's okay. And I said, sure, let's go. This guy stepped out on the porch, never even been to this place before, don't know who these people are. Sure enough, there's this guy with the mark in almost exactly the same place that it was in the dream. I thought, wow, okay. There was another instance at the time when I used to work in the restaurant industry, waiting tables. There was this girl that carried trays because it was a tray service restaurant. And we were watching her one time, and she tended to hold the trays to where, like the front was higher than the back, where it looked like the plates would slide off of this thing. Now, here was the fascinating thing. So there I am. I'm taking a nice little nooner before my evening shift. I go in, and sure enough, I go into the back area because there's like this little bit of a hallway that leads you back into the kitchen where you get your food. And just outside of that area there's an area where you can seat, if you put two round tables together, up to 10 people. I go in. She happened to be taking care of a large group. I think it was about 12 people. She's walking their food out to the table and literally drops the whole tray of food right outside, not walking into the hallway, but outside to deliver it to them, but not too far from the same area that I dreamed not even 2 hours ago. And you begin to wonder, do dreams have prophecy to them? And as you're talking about waking dreams, I would say absolutely, but you have to scratch your head like, but if you have a feeling something like this is going to happen or no, is there a way to avoid it, or should you just have to go through the motions?
There's definitely a way to avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we get into where I burst a few bubbles from time to time because we put such great mystery and mysterious emphasis on the whole idea of prophecy. Mm-hmm. Someone has a prophetic dream, and suddenly, they feel, oh my goodness, well, there's definitely some sort of communication going on, and we give great special attention to those experiences. And they're right. There is something special going on, but it's not quite as complimentary as they may imagine. And one of the things
I'm a Nostradamus, for instance.
That's right. One of the things that I will say to a person like that is, well, maybe if you pay attention to it in the sleeping state the first time, it won't have to repeat it again, dummy, the second time in your awakened life, and it can save you a lot of hassle. Now, I'm usually a little bit more polite than that, but essentially that is the truth. So Daniel, in your dreams, did you have a prophetic experience? Yes, you did. But what was the purpose of the prophecy? I would argue, as I have in my book and do in all of my dream classes, that there was a message in that for you, and that you looked at the message in the dream state the first time and you went, wow, that's really fantastic, and probably left it pretty much there. So whatever it is that works with us on with our inner selves said, no, Daniel didn't pay attention to that one, so we're going to hit him just a little bit harder than that. And so you had the same experience again in the awakened state, and where they very graciously let you watch it from a distance. That isn't always how it happens. And I submit, not only was it that a dream experience for you, but also for the young woman carrying the trays. Obviously, for her, it was a dream symbol too, although it might have had a very different meaning for her than it might have had for you. So whenever we have these kinds of experiences, and especially if they're devastating, I mean, it's one thing to see a tray drop, but let's say you see your house burning down, or you see a tornado coming into your city, and you tend to have dreams that are prophetic. Then I strongly urge a dreamer like that to work on the dream that has happened in the sleep state, what I call sleeping dreams, before this thing is going to manifest in the awakened state, because that's the way you stop it from happening in the awakened state, because you got the message. And that's ultimately what dreams are about. Dreams are about the dreamer. Yes, it's true, it may have something to do with the rest of the world, or your family, or your society, or the political system, but even including all of those possible scenarios, the reason for the dream is to send a message to the dreamer about a course correction, usually, or sometimes a congratulatory message that the dreamer needs to hear at any given time. And that happens in any medium of awareness. So, are you a lucid dreamer? Then that's the same experience. It's one thing to have to really enjoy the lucid experiences of the dream, but ultimately you need to bring it back to the point of metaphor and symbolism and look at those experiences you had in the lucid state as metaphors. There's a wonderful lucid dreamer who's named Robert Wagner. I don't know if you're familiar with that name or not, but he's written a book called Lucid Dreaming Plain and Simple, and he's a very skilled lucid dreamer, meaning that he can really control his dreams. And he says whenever he sees a character, a person, an individual, or sometimes not quite human, in his dream, he has trained himself always to ask the same question, which is, what do you represent in my life? Which is a really profound understanding of the fact that during our waking lives, we're dealing with metaphor and symbols. During our sleeping lives, it's the same thing. During lucid dreams, it's the same thing. During astral travel, it's the same thing. If we have prophecies about the future, it's relevant to now. And if we have experiences with past lives, the only reason those specific past lives are in our awareness is because they are relevant to now.
Now, that's such an interesting point of view, too, as well. And I was going to go back briefly to the gal that we were talking about delivering the tray of food that didn't quite make it to the table. And what was interesting about that was the after effect. Of course, the customers weren't very happy, and I just remember her afterwards and how they didn't tip her out too well either, and she was complaining that it was their fault. So she took the position of being a victim. And a lot of times we do that in life. We tend to, when bad things happen, feel victimized. But as you talk about, when you take a look at what you're talking about here in your book, Always Dreaming, are you a victim, or should we actually say you just really weren't paying attention?
That's really really profound, and it gets touchy, because when you point out to people that in fact if you go to the highest spiritual level that you can view life from, there is no such thing as a victim. This upsets people, especially people who have had really bad things happen to them.
Sure.
But if you then follow the cases of a lot of people who have had really bad things happen to them and watch their evolution over time, they have a way of coming to peace with these horrible things and actually reaching a degree of enlightenment that they did not have before, and actually being grateful for the bad experiences that they have had. So yes, the first reaction we all have is, well, so and so did that to me, or isn't life mean that it puts me through these kinds of unpleasant experiences? Here I am minding my own business and just trying to be a good individual and pay my taxes and pay my bills, and suddenly something comes along that is really undeserved. I've done nothing that warrants this kind of thing, and maybe it has really long-term ramifications, either physiological or who knows, financial, whatever. If we try blaming it on someone else, then we're missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, that's a really hard bit of food to swallow until you learn to do it. And then, Daniel, it's the most liberating, most fantastic understanding that we can have. Because we understand then that we are the ones in control. I mean, if we go through life thinking that what we do is out of control, that it's out of our control, that somehow we are being the victims of this mean system of life, that whatever, sadistic God set up for us here, or maybe there's no God at all, maybe it's just all random, and we're just the pawns of whatever the system of life is out there. That to me is the most unpleasant possibility and the most unpleasant scenario of all. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we understand, bad things happen to us because, as you said earlier, we're not paying attention. And the minute we begin to pay attention, and we begin to not only pay attention, that's the easy part, actually. The difficult part is then, once we have paid attention, to then act on the message that is being delivered to us. That's when we start to understand that we're the ones in control. And once we understand that we're the ones in control of our own life, then we can start doing the things that help us manipulate the circumstances around us in a way that make life a lot smoother.
Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt that life can, especially when you decide to take 100% full responsibility for everything that happens in your life. And I had the wonderful opportunity to talk with one Dr. Hugh Len. Are you familiar with him?
Oh my gosh, he's one of my heroes.
He is.
I know him so well I can even say his first name.
Because sometimes I'm not sure if I get his name right, but I remember Len, but I think it's Hugh Len. But go ahead and correct me, please.
No, Hugh Len is correct.
Okay.
It's the first name. It's Ihalea Kalah Hugh Len.
Yeah, see, there's no way I could do all that. Right. But I'll tell you what, we posted that interview up on our YouTube channel, where this one's definitely going to go for our listeners out there. There is going to be a part 2 where we're really going to get into the meat of this book, but I thought we would have a nice talk about how all this really comes together and then get into the work itself. But the interesting thing about Hugh Len, for those who may not be familiar, is that he developed what is known as the Hawaiian philosophy of Ho'oponopono. And what's really interesting about that is you read through your book, for instance, Always Dreaming, is you find the opportunities that you can integrate that into the circumstances that begin happening to you. So, and as he said when we were talking, he says, whether it's good or bad in your life, do you always notice that you're the one that's there? Think about that. When that bad thing happens, you can't say, why did this happen to me? It did because you were there. And when you get that, you start realizing, wow, and you start looking around and observing and paying attention a lot more, and it really becomes fascinating, is what you're talking about here, and how often life is speaking to us and say, look, when are you going to realize, as Bruce Lee once said, that you're not doing it right, you're doing it all wrong? When are you going to get this?
You know, that's really interesting about it. You are always there. Let's touch a little more on Dr. Hewlett again, because he one of the things that he says is that, and I want to make sure to say this in relation to my own work too, is there is a difference between trying to manipulate your life for a specific, very, specific, that's really the best word, outcome.
Mm-hmm. Or goal, we could do that too.
And asking for a generalized outcome. Now, if you notice Dr. Hugh Lin, what he always presents to, for lack of a better word, the universe, or to God, or the source, or whatever term you want to use, he always presents the problem. He does not present what he thinks the solution ought to be. And that's really an important distinction, and I also say the same thing in my book. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, I am uncomfortable right now. I feel incomplete. I feel unwhole about what it is that I want to have my life be like. Now, we might think of a way that might make that better, but we really don't have the overview to see what would really make it better. And what Dr. Hewlett does in his work, and I do in my work, is instead of presenting what we think the solution ought to be, we simply present the problem and allow whatever that is that has a bigger overview than we have to then direct how it feels is the best direction for us to go. And sometimes that also is disconcerting, because sometimes, you know, what we have to do, we think we need to go from point A to point B, and actually the thing out there that sees the overview is saying, no, actually what you need to do is you need to make an about face here and go to point W, which is a whole lot further down the road and much better for you. So I'm going to turn you around to go in another direction. And we're so fixated on thinking that we need to get to point B that we resist. But one of the things you learn to do is you learn to surrender. First of all, you learn to understand that you are responsible for it all. You read the metaphors, and as you say, we can get into how you go about doing that at a later time. But philosophically, you learn to read the metaphors. And once you learn to read the metaphors, then you surrender the whole thing to this process. And you start with really insignificant issues, ones that you really don't care very much about how they come out. And then when you see that even in those really silly things, like maybe dropping trays of food, that this thing really has your best interests in mind, then you start surrendering issues that are larger and larger in your life. Mm-hmm. And that's when you really start paying attention to how this whole thing works. And you start surrendering issues like marriage and career and health, and always with your heart in your throat at first, until you see, no, it works on these issues as well, as huge and as big as they are. It's there for me. It's there working on my behalf. And if I can go beyond what I think is the objective experience and look at it from the perspective of metaphor, I will get even more out of this than if I don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, it was, as I was reading your book, it was interesting how I'd imagine being in your dream workshops can be a heck of a lot of fun. And they're certainly eye-opening and enlightening, to say the least, from the many stories that you share from some of the people that you've worked with over the years. And what really came to mind, too, again, we're getting to the idea for the listeners out there that you're truly more empowered over your life than you believe you are, but what you need to do is start paying attention to how life is really trying to help you along to fulfill your desires, but as you said, don't try to force the desire in a linear A to B way that you believe. Pretty much open your hands, and you hear this too, it's a philosophy, it's even something Jesus talked about and how you manifest miracles. The first idea is that you have the thought, then you bring that thought into your heart, and then you express it and bring it into reality. And as they say, especially if you attend any good goal workshops, they say, well, if you have a goal, what you need to do is write it down. And it took me a lot of years to understand why you do that. It's because you want to take it from a metaphysical to a physical reality. How you get to that goal, though, you shouldn't force that as much because you may run into problems. And I think that that's where we need to sort of surrender to the mystery of life, that we're on our way. It's much like, as you like to quote regularly in your book, Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey. You know, the idea that you want the talisman or the chalice or whatever it is that you're seeking. You're going to go and rescue the princess out of the castle, but you're probably going to go through a lot of these other things before you get there, and there's good reason behind that. And just recently, for instance, they had remade the movie, I'm trying to remember what it was, The Clash of the Titans.
Yeah.
Okay? And me personally, my opinion, I thought they did a very poor job with that movie. And when you look at the hokey one that was done starring Harry Hamlin, you know, my wife was asking me, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, this mythology here makes no sense. He just all of a sudden has this flying horse. He's all of a sudden got all this and this, and it's full of bravado. Let's go back to the one they did back in the 1980s with the great, you know, special effects by Ray Harryhausen of all things. But look, there was a reason he needed the Pegasus. You know, there were these reasons, and you get to see this.
Right.
And therefore, the journey for him to go rescue the princess wasn't as linear as this newer version made out to be.
You know, that's so Western. We think it needs to be linear. So here comes the knight, and let's take on the role of the knight for ourselves. So here we are, the knight. We see the castle, and we know the damsel is up there on the third floor because she's waving out the window. So we think what we need to do is go across the drawbridge, open the front door, and climb the stairs and get there. That's the direct linear thing. Well, so those of us who think that way are going to try to go across that drawbridge, and we're going to get probably kicked because there's going to be all kinds of defensive mechanisms there that are going to prevent us from getting so directly. The smart one, the smart knight, is the one who is going to understand that the most direct route is not necessarily the linear one, who's going to stop and listen to this whole, as you say, way in which life is talking to us constantly. And it may be that the knight needs to turn around and go back 50 paces because there underneath a bush is a tunnel. And that's the opening to the tunnel there. And that he's got to tunnel underneath this thing, and it's going to put him in the rear of the castle. And now he's got to climb up to the roof and go across the rafters and come down to the third floor where the damsel is. But that's the trusting process. That's the part that we need to allow ourselves to, well, maybe to train ourselves to do. And one of the very best ways to start doing this is to start seeing life from the perspective of metaphor, because, as you say, it is talking to us constantly. 24 hours a day, this communication is going on. So if we are the type who don't remember our dreams at night, we no longer have any excuse, because those same dreams are going on while we are wide awake, and we are being given messages, the little hints, the little cues that are going to get us to the damsel in distress up there on the third floor. But we have to be willing to stop thinking linearly and thinking in this objective fashion that we in the West are so fond of.
Mm-hmm. I know when it comes to, it seems to be the big key word, this at least over the last 10 years perhaps, you know, there's this law of attraction, okay? And then people get confused when they try to participate in it the way they believe they should be. They say, well, wait a minute, this law of attraction isn't working for me. And I would actually contend, actually the law of attraction works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but you got to question, what are you attracting? This goes back to the empowerment and paying attention to your waking life. And should you have a dreaming life, that as well. But there was a friend of mine a few years back who had finally lost his job after about 5 years. And again, when something devastatingly that seems to just happen what we believe to be out of the blue, we immediately say, we're the victim. God, I can't believe those bosses fired me. I was, one of the best workers they had. I always worked late and weekends and pretty much just gave my life's blood to this company, and just one day they let me go. Well, based on, for instance, after having interviewed Dr. Len, as we were talking about earlier, and the ideal of Ho'oponopono, I said, well, let's go ahead and take a look at this for a minute. I said, did you really like the job? Oh, yeah, I did. Okay, so here comes the defense. I was just committed to the company. And I said, well, let's look at it a little further. Were there any days that you had Monday morning blues? Well, yeah. And I said, well, how regular were those? Well, actually, they were quite a bit. Well, how long were you feeling those Monday morning blues? And he began to admit, well, actually, for quite a few years. And I said, okay, well, let's go back. When did you first remember having the Monday morning blues? He goes back even further. Well, after about the first year, the job just didn't feel like it did in the first year that it did. And I said, okay, so now let's take a look at your thinking. How did you feel about your boss or your managers? So as we just slowly began to uncover this, I began to say, do you see that you had a pattern of thinking that goes back 4 years that said, I am very unsatisfied with this job?
Yeah.
And that's all I did, is I just stood back. I wasn't trying to point him with my idea of what happened. I was just trying to share with him, do you see that you really thought yourself out of a job? And he came back at me. We ran into each other about 1.5 years ago, and he says, I can't believe how liberating that conversation really was.
Isn't that great? The fact is, here's how the law of attraction works.
Mm-hmm.
What you attract to yourself is the metaphoric image of who you are in a given moment.
Right.
Now, if you think of yourself as being, well, I have well, your friend is a good example. He had an image of himself that was different than what was really going on. What you're going to attract to yourself is not your image of what you think you are, but rather you will attract to yourself that which you actually are, that which you actually are expressing. And that which you, due to your attitudes, is the way you are approaching life. And when there is this dichotomy between what you think you ought to be and what you really are, and that dichotomy gets wider and wider in a split, that's when you're going to attract to yourself a sudden, usually unpleasant, sometimes shocking experience that is going to try to deliver to you a message that is going to say, hey, you're making a left turn here when you really ought to be going straight. Mm-hmm. And those are the ones that you need to read and you need to learn about, and you need to learn the language of the dream, because it is so helpful. It really is incredibly liberating.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have probably a little over 5 minutes, so I'd like to end this show with exactly what you're talking about in relation to one of the stories that you share here in your book. When you talk about, as we came to this point, there's who you think you are, but then there's who you really are, as far as what you're projecting out there to the world. And the world feeds you the exact energy you're putting out there. Would that be a pretty safe assumption?
Boy, I think you nailed it.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So now, what I'd like you to do is share this particular story about one computer technician.
Okay. Okay, right. Well,
you
right.
see, because that waking dream there was pretty interesting.
Right. Okay. Well, this was a fellow who lived in a rural area in New England, and in the book I call him Stan, so we'll call him Stan. And Stan had gone to New York City to a computer conference there. And at the computer conference, which was, again, mostly about gadgets and, the latest technology and so forth, they nevertheless had some talks. And he attended one in which the gist of the talk was essentially that computer experts, technicians, tend to be a little bit nerdy, and so they are not as cognizant about their business lives as they ought to be. And so the speakers set up some guidelines about pay and what the nerds should be, what the computer technicians should be charging. Well, when Stan looked at his own charges in relation to what this guy in New York City felt that he ought to be charging, he was fairly chagrined because his prices were really a whole lot lower. And so he came back home and he made this great decision that he was going to up all of his charges. So he's in this rural area, and he was a little bit earlier for an appointment, and he started taking a walk down this country road, looking. It was fall, it was autumn, so all the leaves were turning, which they do back in New England so beautifully. And suddenly, out of a driveway that he didn't see, not one but two sizable Doberman pinchers started charging right straight at him. And basically, he thought that his life was over. And this is the kind of experience that both you and I, Daniel, have been talking about, where this sudden, shocking thing happens to you that completely throws you for a loop. Well, he's a slight physical build, and he just felt that he was going to die. Well, as a matter of fact, the two Dobermans came rushing up to him and then screeched on the brakes and started sniffing him, wagging their tails furiously. And they didn't do him any harm at all. But what they did do, they didn't do him any physical harm. What they did do was they just about stopped his heart. The guy was so freaked out that he couldn't deal with his appointment or anything else, and he just went home and collapsed. But he'd worked with the Waking Dream, and he knew that this was an important one. So he and I got together, and I know we only have a minute or so left, but the gist of the Waking Dream was that the dogs were him, and the dogs were coming on really aggressively about his pay scale and how they were going to change something that really didn't need any changing. And in fact, they turned out not to be aggressive at all, that they were these real loving pussycats, essentially. And that they were showing him his own energy, that the reason he was charging less for his computer appointments was because he lived in a rural area, and everybody there had decided they preferred this rural, quiet lifestyle to the frantic pace of a cosmopolitan area. And so, they didn't make as much money, and so everything was a little bit more laid back. But the trade-off was that, they weren't as stressed out as everybody else. Mm-hmm. And the idea that he was going to charge more for was completely contrary to his own personality. And these dogs were showing him that. You're not this aggressive animal. You're just a calm and loving person, so quit trying to act like something that you're not.
Right. And, that's what makes this such a fascinating conversation when it comes to waking and sleeping dreams. And as we go into part 2 for our listeners out there, we're going to be talking about the 5 steps of dream interpretation and also the 3 ways where you don't overanalyze all these things that happen in your life, because I think when people begin to read your book, they'll realize, oh my goodness, I've got to pay attention to everything. But in fact, you actually give 3 steps, and one of them you just said there with the Dobermans is when the incident creates shock, then you need to pay attention. Why don't we go ahead and mention what the other 2 are and just kind of tease our listeners. Part 2 is going to be a lot different.
Okay. Well, there are, as I said earlier in this conversation, the bottom line of all of them is that the experience doesn't leave you. It stays there, as you can imagine, with Stan and the Dobermans. He just couldn't get over it, and it really upset him.
I don't think anybody could. 2 Dobermans out on a country road. Wow.
I mean, it would be really frightening. Yeah, no question about it. So within that, there are 3 different categories. One is a shocking experience, which I would say, the Dobermans definitely was.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is a bizarre experience, and one example I like to give is that of a guy who was late for a very important business meeting that was not at his place of work, but was at a central meeting office building. And so he was rushing out the building, and he had his car keys in his briefcase and all this stuff, maybe his lunch with him too. And he got to his car, and he was trying to juggle everything so he could get his key out to open the car door. And the keys slipped out of his hand in his hurry, and there happened to be a sewer grate right there. And the keys slipped through the sewer grate, and that was the end of his meeting. He could not get in his car, and he couldn't, and this is probably something that only has ever happened to him once in his whole life, and it wasn't frightening in the sense that it threatened his physical well-being, but it was a bizarre experience, and again, it stayed with him. It was upsetting. Mm-hmm. He didn't make his meeting, and he had to go get all these keys replaced, and these days car keys cost a lot of money to get replacements for them, and so that's the second type, a bizarre experience. Now, actually, bizarre experiences don't necessarily have to be frightening, but the problem is when they're funny or they're delightful, we don't pay attention to them as metaphors.
And we'll go ahead and we'll get into that. I'm sorry, David. We have about a minute left, okay. So we'll go to the third one here.
Okay, yes. Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. See, this is how exciting it is, folks. You're going to be in for a real ride when we do part 2 on this.
The third type is a repetitive dream.
Okay.
Where the same symbol comes into your life over and over again when it has never come before. And the most recent one I can tell you about is one that somebody just told me about, where she was driving along and saw a shirt lying in the road. And then she was driving in a completely different part of town, and there was another shirt lying in the road. And then there was a third incident where there was still another shirt lying in the road. So those again, bizarre, strange, but repetitive, and that was the thing that was poignant about it.
So we leave the listeners here on Beyond 50 today with always dreaming, the idea that what you need to pay attention to mostly is the situation something that's startling or shocking, or is it bizarre, or is it repetitive? So that way you don't overanalyze anything. But if one of those three things happen, pay attention. And in the next segment, what we do is we're going to be talking about how we can begin to open this up, understand the metaphors, and really see what kind of revelations that you can come to when it comes to your own life when you're dreaming. And David, first of all, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us on the program, and quickly go ahead and give out a website for our listeners where they can find out more.
Sure. It's teacherofdreams.com. That's all one word, www.teacherofdreams.com.
Very good. David, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to having you on part 2 of Always Dreaming. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. It was no accident you were here, but you can also find yourself intentionally at our website, which is beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Discover what we have for you and sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. You can also follow us on Twitter at beyond50radio.com and visit our Facebook page, like that as well, too, and that's Facebook Beyond 50 Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.